Chapter 11. In retirement, James and Dolly settled down to a kind of routine at Montpelier. After breaking fast, after breakfast, James might check the tin cup he kept at the gate to measure the rainfall. Then, with whatever guests were present, and there were always guests, he would sit down facing the Blue Ridge Mountains and visit. Later in the morning, riding on his favorite horse, Liberty, he would make his daily inspection of the plantation, carrying with him his special cane uh, of the plantation, uh, carrying with him a crooked one that enabled him to open and shut gates without getting down from his horse. At 2 o'clock sharp, he would visit his mother in her private quarters at Montpelier, and sometimes during the day he and Dolly would take a walk. They believed in regular exercise. If it was raining, they might raise each other back and forth across the front porch. Even then, she reached 60 Dolly Even when she reached 60, Dolly was a fast runner and proud of it. Left to herself, Dolly read novels. She didn't like the gory ones, and she gardened, wearing an enormous bonnet that she herself called hideous. She would inspect the roses in the little walled English garden that James had built for her, and if a particular flower took her fancy, she would name it for a person she loved. Occasionally, she and James would ride to nearby relatives, but more often they would visit Jefferson at Monticello. Jefferson, feebler now in his old age, still rode his horse, Old Eagle, but he couldn't mount without help, no longer following public affairs as closely as James did. He was completely absorbed in the one project that was dearest to him, building the new University of Virginia in Charlesville. James entered enthusiastically into Jefferson's plans, and even after the university opened in 1825, he continued his strong support. But perhaps the happiest time these three had together was in 1824, when General Lafayette came to America for a grand tour. Never in the history of America has a hero been given more exuberant welcome. Wherever he went, he was cheered, more greeted with parades, banquets, fireworks displays. Although there were not many left who had actually known him, Lafayette had become a legend and an excuse for everyone to celebrate the revolution once again. But to visit with old Jefferson at Monticello, where James and Dolly joined them, Lafayette had changed. Just to look at him, James said he would not have known Lafayette. He had grown very fat, but once he started talking, he was his old, ebullient self. And how wonderful it was to be together. It was to be together. They shared memories, laughed, and for the brief time they were all young again. Throughout his retirement, however, James had provided worries that plagued him, money especially. He was running short of it. Like Washington and Jefferson before him, he had not been able to save anything from his president's salary, $25,000. And although he had counted on his crops to supplement his income, they had not done well. And of course, it cost money to feed the constant stream of visitors and their houses who came to Montpelier. They were eating him out of house and hay, Madison said. And then there was Payne, no longer his stepfather's secretary. He had acquired 104 acres of land close to Montpelier, where James and Dolly hoped he would finally settle down. Occasionally he did have ideas. Once he thought he raised silkworms and actually sent to France for people experienced in the business, but he never got around to sending for the silkworms. Once he thought he had marble on his property and planned to grow rich mining it. But he never did more than bring home rocks for his parents to admire. Always he was slipping off. Where? No one knew. All James could be certain of was that when he reappeared, he would be further in debt, and always he was. But time kept moving ahead, occasionally lunging forward in ways that the Madisons found hard to accept. On July 4th, 1826, on the 15th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson died. It was one of the most extraordinary coincidences in American history. Yet this was exactly when Jefferson, who knew he had little time left, wanted to die. If he could only hold out until July 4th, he said. Apparently, this would give him the feeling of rounding out his circle of life, for he took pride in having written the Declaration of Independence. Just just before he died, Jefferson handed his gold topped walking cane to his doctor and asked him to deliver it personally to Madison. And walking cane was perhaps a man's most intimate possession. Madison recognized the gift as the last acknowledgment of a long friendship. But how could he imagine a world without Jefferson at the top of the hill? Time seemed to lung forward against when, in 1829, Andrew Jackson, the hero of New Orleans, became president, succeeding John Quincy Adams, who in turn had succeeded Monroe. America had grown and changed. No longer the small farming country in which Dolly and James had grown up. Now there were 23 states, and the cities were crowded and industrialized. Up to this time, men of property had run the government, but suddenly there was a cry from the common people, and from those who lived in the West. They did not feel properly represented in Washington. But Andrew Jackson was a man of the people. He came from Tennessee, and he would change all that. Still, some people did not like the idea of change at all. John Randolph, the eternal pessimist, announced, "The country is ruined past redemptions." James Madison, however, had always known that the country was bound to change and took a long view of the future. By 1929, he figured America would probably have a population of 192 million. But this did not worry him. He couldn't imagine what the country would be like. But of course, it would have different kinds of people, many with new occupations and interests, expressing novel ideas. That was all right with Madison. Let the country expand, he said. Only let it remember that the key to strength was union. If union had been the watchword of Madison's career, it it was the very heartbeat of his old age. Would he be a delegate to Richmond Con- Convention to draft a new constitution for Virginia? Of course he would. The year was 1829, and Madison was 78 years old. The last surviving member of the Federal Constitutional Convention of 1787, his voice was weaker than it his voice was weaker than it had ever been. But if there was anything he could do to make the government work better, he wanted to do it. He wanted to try to extend voting privileges. He wanted to help the western part of the states feel that it had more share in the government. And if the Constitution didn't turn out exactly as he wanted, he would still be glad he tried. Would he become president of the American Colonization Society? He was 84 when this invention came, but how could he refuse? He was 84 when this invitation came, but how could he refuse? The only solution to slavery still seemed to lie in resettling the slaves in colonies in Africa. Yet he knew this plan wasn't working. So far, they had managed to ship off only 2 to 3,000 slaves, while every year the slave population increased by 60,000. Six of his own slaves, who could see the financial troubles of the Madisons, begged to be sold to a kind master rather than be sent to a country they had never seen. Reluctantly, Madison agreed, yet he couldn't shake off his feeling of guilt and his fear. Slavery was dividing the land. Where would it lead? Yet in 1832, a more direct threat had been hurled at the Union. The people of South Carolina did not like a new tariff that others said favored the North and imposed a hardship on them. And if a state did not like the law, according to John C. Calhoun of South Carolina, a state needed to obey it. He called this the doctrine of nullification, and he went further. If the federal government tried to force a state to obey law it didn't like, the state had every right to secede from the Union. He said there was a precedent for this view. Madison and Jefferson had themselves implied just such an idea in the Virginia and Kentucky resolves, which they had written to oppose John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts. No, not true. Madison picked up his pen and replied in no uncertain terms. He and Jefferson had simply been protesting, which was a lawful procedure. State power could never simply throw off federal law as it as if it were just so much trash. Colin Hall was putting pow- powder under the Constitution, and as long as James Madison had breath in his body, he would oppose him. He was relieved to learn that Andrew Jackson felt as strongly as he did. To say that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union, Jackson stated, is to say that the Union's United States is not a nation. What was more, Jackson privately threatened that if one drop of blood be shed in defense of the law of the United States, I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on to it the first tree I can find. Eventually, the danger of nullification subsided as the tariff was reduced, but Madison remained uneasy about the future. South Carolina, by South Carolina, by putting forward the idea of nullification, had encouraged a spirit of disunion. It seemed more important than ever to Madison that he get his notes on the con- Constitutional Convention in proper shape so that they could be printed after his death. He felt sure that the government would buy his notes and publish them, for certainly future generations should know that what took place in Philadelphia. In order to preserve the Constitution, they would need to understand the thinking of the farmers and what they had sacrificed to bring about the compromises that not only made their union possible, but were meant to make it endure. Over the last year, as he was finishing the work, he was often bedridden with arthritis. His handwriting, he told a friend, became smaller as he grew older, and his steps shorter. There were months when he couldn't write at all, and then Dolly sat at his bedside, taking notes for hours at a time. It was a tedious business, she said. Sometimes when she was working alone, she kept a music box playing at her side. But the work was getting done. By the middle of June in 1836, it was clear that James Madison could not survive much longer. Perhaps his friends said he could hold out until July 4th, 5 years before. James Monroe became the third president to die on July 4th. It seemed to have become almost a tradition for great Americans to die on that day. Madison was asked if he would like the doctor to try to keep him alive until that date, but Madison said no. He was 85 years old now and at peace with himself. He had a last message, however, that he wanted to leave the country. The advice nearest my heart and deepest in my conviction, he said, is that the Union of States be cherished and perpetuated. On the morning of June 27th, when his niece brought his breakfast to him, he said he didn't want it. What is the What is the matter, Uncle James? She asked. Nothing more than a change of mind, my dear, he replied. His head dropped on his pillow, and he stopped breathing. What what did he mean? Had he thought that perhaps he might hold out until July 4th without the doctor's help? Was he referring to the change that death brings? Or was he simply saying he had changed his mind about breakfast? No one will know. He was buried in the family plot a half a mile south of the house. His tombstone was the shape of an obelisk, which was the fashion of the day, but the inscription simply read Madison. No first name was needed. For the country as well as Dolly, there was only one Madison. Dolly lived for 13 more years, but because her estate was so mismanaged by Payne, she had to sell Montpelier and moved to Washington. She re entered Washington society like a returning queen and was welcomed as such. She held open house on New Year's Day and on July 4th, just as she always had. And when she died at the age of 81, she was buried in Washington. Her many friends, however, recognized that this was not the right resting place for Dolly. They raised money by subscription, and about 10 years later, she was moved to the little family plot in Montpelier. She took her place beside Madison, which is where she belongs.